My name is Jason.
And my name is David.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. All right, this is episode 3 of our Dungeon World Basics series. Last Basics episode, we covered the combat basic moves, and this episode, we are going to cover the non-combat basic moves. We are also going to do a little bit more actual play at the end. One note, we are going to cover these special moves next episode. So between episodes 2, 3, and 4, you're going to get pretty much the bulk of the rules of the game, I feel like. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, once you've got those down, then it's really about playbooks and what's going on with them. And, you figure out one playbook, you've really figured out a lot of them, how they work anyways, and then you just have to read the specific rules of them.
Yeah, it's just small stuff, ephemera, maybe how to read a monster stat block, I guess, just little things, but it's going to be great. So let's begin with the first move.
So the first move is Defy Danger, and this is probably the one that you're going to be using most frequently. This is the catch-all. Whenever you need to have a roll for something, this is the one that you're going to do it with. So in a fantasy adventure game, the move's trigger is when you act despite an imminent threat or suffer a calamity. So it's going to happen a lot.
Yeah, it very, very frequently hit in a fantasy adventure game. And like you said, it is a very functional catch-all sort of move. If another move doesn't cover your dangerous situation, Defy Danger should do the trick. The fact that all of the stats are in play means pretty much any way a player chooses to deal with a dangerous situation is kind of covered by this move, right?
Right. So, yeah, listening to how your player describes themselves dealing with the situation is going to inform you which stat you're going to use.
Importantly, one thing I think that somewhat distinguishes Defy Danger from other moves is that this move is usually called for by the GM. The way it normally works is a player will say, I want to do X, and the GM will respond, that's possible, but first you will need to defy danger in order to avoid Y. I've got an example here in our notes, David. Why don't we go through that?
Sure.
I'll be the player.
All right.
So I'm the player and I say to you, I want to run past the giant to the other side of the temple and grab the flaming sword on the altar.
Okay, so you can do that, but first you need to defy danger to dodge the giant's club swing. What does that look like?
Well, I run forward and then I roll under the club swing between the giant's legs.
Great, that sounds like a defy danger with dexterity, so plus dex, because you're acting fast.
And that's pretty much how those defy danger usually goes. Another example, maybe I said, I run forward and use my shield to knock the giant's club swing away.
Okay, great. Then that's probably Defy Danger with strength because you're powering through, trying to knock that club away.
So there you can kind of see like two different ways of solving the basic problem, the danger of the giant's club swing, right? I suppose you could have approached the situation even more wildly different depending on the circumstance, where maybe before the giant attacks you, you try to reason with the giant, right?
And that's something that happens in fantasy adventures sometimes.
It is indeed some of the oldest fantasy adventures, in fact. And in which case that would probably be, I think you can probably make a strong case for Defy Danger with charisma, right?
You could, if it seemed like the giant could be reasoned with. Otherwise, there might be some other issue there.
Yeah, but just to say that, one thing I think is really important here as the GM with Defy Danger is to be generous in interpreting the stat triggers, right? You do have a lot of range of possibility with 6 stats to pick from, but sometimes, the player will describe something that maybe doesn't neatly fit into one particular stat. Just go with what makes the most sense and you'll be okay. It's not a big deal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the important thing is you are letting the system resolve the danger for you.
One thing I think we should talk about before we move on from Defy Danger is interpreting the 7 to 9 result, which is probably the most difficult feat of GMing in Dungeon World, right? It's the toughest thing. It's the thing that most GMs have the most trouble with in Dungeon World is interpreting the 7 to 9 on Defy Danger. Because what the 7 to 9 says is the character is still going to do what they intended to do, but there is a worse outcome, a hard bargain, or an ugly choice. And regrettably, the Dungeon World text is not very good at describing what that means. There are a lot of like other texts out there that, and other blog posts and things like that, which discuss this at some length. And if you want a deeper insight into the 7 to 9 result on Defy Danger, I strongly recommend looking at those things. I would also direct you to our back catalog of episodes of this show. But just a sort of like brief overview, what does worse outcome, hard bargain, or ugly choice mean? Before we even get into that, I want to just emphasize here that on the 7 to 9, the player character still succeeds. That's really important.
Right. Yeah, and I would strongly encourage you to let them have their success and not somehow rob them of their success.
Yeah. 7, a complication doesn't mean they don't do what they set out to do. And I think understanding that is kind of the first step in understanding how to interpret the 7 to 9 result. So why don't we just do like a quick example using our giant and his club swing from earlier, for each of worse outcome, hard bargain, or ugly choice. So worse outcome, here's an option. A worse outcome in the previous example might be that you get past the giant, but you get clipped by the club slightly and take a d6 damage. So see there, it's the same outcome because they're getting past the giant, but it's a worse outcome because they wanted to get past the giant without taking any damage, right?
Right. God, I just want to like tear into why is it 1d6 damage, but
Well, the reason, that's actually a great question and a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but I will say this real quickly. I do think that it's somewhat stealing the victory away from the player if they suffer the whole amount of damage from the giant, right? As long as the complication is literally worse, I think it's okay. It doesn't have to be like punitively worse. It just needs to be worse, right?
Right. Yeah, that's fair. All right. So here's what like a hard bargain would be like. You will get past the giant, but then you'll be trapped on that side of the temple. Do you still want to go through with it? So you give the player the option.
Right. I consider this to be really good Dungeon World GMing, knowing how to work the hard bargain. It is a fundamental feature of not only this system, but other games that are powered by the apocalypse. That is to say, they're inspired by Apocalypse World. This idea of stepping out of the moment briefly to discuss as GM and player what might be happening in the scene, giving the player a chance to make a decision about it, and then going back into the fiction and resolving based off what the player decided. And the hard bargain is a great example of that. And I love that example that you have there. It's a really, really solid example of a hard bargain.
To be fair, like, you could have done this as a worse outcome, but giving them the option is something you shouldn't shy away from.
Right. And I think because you're giving them the option, I think that hard bargain needs to be really tough. And
right.
I think the one you listed is pretty tough. Like, yeah, you get over there, but you're fucking trapped. Like, that's worse than taking a d6 damage, right?
It could be. It sure could be.
What about ugly choice?
All right. So for an ugly choice, you get past the giant, but you have to draw him closer to your companions, putting one of them in danger. Pick one.
Love that kind of ugly choice. That's one way of doing an ugly choice for sure. That's usually how I do it. I basically give the player a choice about like 2 awful outcomes and let them choose. It's especially delicious when like in David's example, you have to pick which of your companions is going to suffer because of your action.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty devious. I always get too caught up in the ugly choice one where I try and make 2 very distinct ugly choices, one of which they must pick, but like this is much, much simpler and you can do this much quicker.
Yeah. I think in all things with Defy Danger, I think you just need to stay within the scope of whatever's happening in the fiction, right? Your Defy Danger might be much bigger in scope, right? Like it might involve bigger stakes, in which case, you just amplify the complications, accordingly.
That's true. All right. So that's Defy Danger.
Yeah. Let's move on to Spout Lore.
Great. So Spout Lore is one of 2 information gathering moves that are in the basic moves. Spout Lore is the move that's going to help you learn about the lore of the world, as the name implies.
Yeah, and it serves a very practical purpose because the characters have years of existing in a fantasy profession to rely on, right? But the players do not. Spout Lore gives us a framework to reveal what the characters know.
Right.
I think the sort of initial thing to be concerned with on Spout Lore is what I call the problem of the trigger. It's not really a problem, but it is kind of a problem in that it's a little weird. So what I always struggled with when I first started playing Dungeon World was this question of, well, does the player just say, I'm consulting my accumulated knowledge about this? And the answer is kind of yes, right? Like it's a bit weird because it's not an action oriented trigger, but pretty much anytime the player says something like, do I know about this? Have I seen this? Is this something I'm familiar with? They're triggering spout lore, right?
Right. So yeah, it is tricky with both this move and to a lesser extent the other information gathering move, because they're more, I don't know, they are not very action oriented.
Well, I think discern realities can be.
It can be more so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is. I mean, because you have to actually like do things for discern realities. It's an external process, but spout lore is so internal, right? Like, right. You're just kind of, on screen, you're just sitting there, right? Like, it's not cinematic, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah, that's very, very true. And I think it is important to point out that, like, though your characters may be level 1 characters, like you said, like they've been here for a long time, they know what they're doing, and characters in Dungeon World are assumed competent. So, I
mean, a 12-year-old in present day Earth has a lot of accumulated knowledge that we wouldn't expect to know as players, right? Like if we were playing that character. I mean, I think like spout lore solves a really great problem. This is getting a little philosophical now, but spout lore solves a problem that some other fantasy games have, in that in other fantasy games, the GM often wants you, the player, to provide the answer based off just what you know. And that can be complicated if you don't know about this fantasy world, right? As a player.
Right. Definitely. It helps. This is how your players learn what the characters already know, which is interesting. So what if the player asks about something the GM has not prepared for? What then?
Fabulous. Moments like this are what make Dungeon World exciting, in my opinion. It's possible the GM didn't consider this particular bit of the dungeon that the player is asking about to be important, right? And this happens, right? You and I have GM'd a lot of Dungeon World, and it happens. The player is really focused on some tapestry hanging on the wall that you mentioned as a bit of color, but they think is really important. I think there's different ways you can do it. One way of handling it is just to be completely honest and say, you know what, or let them roll and then just tell them something interesting or useful. And maybe it's just per se interesting or useful. It may not have any meaning for the bigger adventure, right? That's one way of doing it. I think the better way of doing it is to try to find a way of making it important in the adventure. The answer doesn't have to be mind-blowing or complex. It merely needs to be interesting or useful. And so you could just go with like the simple answer, go with the honest answer. What I think is really great in spout lore, and what I think is a really terrific opportunity, and what I think makes Dungeon World stand apart from a lot of other games, is it invites you to, in moments like this, you are invited, and indeed I think you should, engage in a conversation with the table, right? You can be very open as the GM and say, hey, you know what? I hadn't really thought about what this might be about, right? But I don't know, but there might be something there. What do you guys think, right? And then talk about it as players. And then let whatever the players say, let that inform, the answers of what is interesting or what is useful. It's a collaborative process, right? We said that in the very beginning of this series. We said that the words we say at the table, have a lot of power. And this is one of those instances. Right.
Yeah. It's definitely a conversation that can be had, in particular with something that you had no idea they were going to fixate on. So that's great.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of cases, what the stuff they're interested in is going to be important to the adventure because you have it there for a reason. But, every now and then you get something like that where that's not the case.
Yeah. I mean, most frequently, like spout lore, I see it used as like a way to try and figure out how a magic item works, which is a great use for it.
Yeah, that's a super common use because in most other cases in the dungeon, it's more of a discern realities because you're looking at things, right? You occasionally run into like the sigil of a noble house that is important to the plot of the adventure, and maybe they need to spout lore to figure something out about that noble family. But for the most part, like the characters are observing things in the dungeon, collecting things in the dungeon, and then using spout lore to learn about those things, like you said.
All right, well, let's move on to discern realities since you brought it up. This is another move like Defy Danger that you're going to be using all the freaking time. So get comfortable with it. Get comfortable with the questions.
Yeah, the move trigger is very important on Discern Realities, which is when you closely study a situation or person. The important thing here, I think, is not to let the player get away with simply saying, I'm going to study this closely, right? Make them work for a little bit. Have them show what the character is actually doing. You'll recall, David, one of the very first examples we did in this series when we were talking generally about move triggering, we talked about the example of an orc encampment that the player character was investigating. And we described them. I've got the notes here. It says, I carefully move around the perimeter of the encampment, staying hidden behind trees and watching what the orcs are doing. That is a way of triggering Discern Realities. And I think this is super important because you're not asking the player to give you this kind of detail in how they're doing something just to be a pain in the butt, right? You're doing it because describing our characters' actions in this way provides a richness and a texture to the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's a good way of handling it when there is like time to let it breathe a little bit. But like sometimes you have a player who's trying to discern realities like in a split second almost, trying to find a way to deal with an immediate problem. I think you can still trigger the move then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it begs the question of whether that counts as studying it closely. I mean, I think it depends on the context for sure. I often will let characters trigger discern realities in a much tighter time frame, in a much more like urgent situation. But what I do is I also tailor the amount of information they can get appropriately, right?
Right.
Like just because like I let them fire the move off and just because I'm being generous with what counts as studying something closely doesn't mean they get the full benefit of like having studied something closely, right? They just get whatever they are entitled to based off what they said they did. So, and I think that's super important for discern realities as a general matter, right? Whenever you're answering a question for discern realities, you need to be honest. That's important. Be honest about it. But part of being honest means not necessarily giving them everything, right? Like just kind of think carefully about what the player actually described a character doing and then give them something that makes sense based off what they said. That just takes practice. It's not easy, right? But like it's something that it's a good skill to practice and it's going to serve you well in Dungeon World.
Yeah. So what happens if a player asks a question and there's really nothing there?
I think part of being honest is to say there's nothing there, right? Because that's equally useful to the player, right? Like if they're kind of hinting around trying to figure out, or if they're kind of suggesting that they're trying to find out if there's danger in a situation, based off the questions they're asking, like what here is not what it appears to be. And you say, nothing. It's all as you would expect. It's all cool. They know you're being honest because you have to be. It's in the rules. And so that's helpful to them, right? So yeah, they're not learning anything, but they are kind of learning something.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another common situation, fairly common situation with discern realities is the player wants to ask something that's not on the list. Have you had that happen, David?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because it is a tailored list of questions and it is exhaustive if I'm understanding the game correctly.
Yeah. It's interpretively exhaustive.
Right.
Well, so, how do you handle that? What do you do?
If they're asking a question and I really know what the information is that they're seeking, I'll let them either rephrase the question slightly or I'll just answer the question in a way that is answering what they are really driving at. Sometimes I'll ask them, what do you mean? Like, what are you looking for with that question? And let them expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I handle it too. The rules of the game are actually that you basically force them to ask one of the other questions, right? But maybe you guide them toward the one that makes the most sense. So for example, if the player asks what kind of creature ran through here recently, you might say, maybe what happened here recently, right? Or, the player says, the player sometimes will give you a lot of information before they ask the question, right? Like this is a pretty common thing. The player says something like, I'm really concerned that the wizard is hiding here and has laid a bunch of magical traps, and I want to figure out like where all the traps are, and I'm really scared about being in this situation. Like they give you this big preamble, right? Before they ask the question. And sometimes it's because they don't know what question to ask. Sometimes it's because they're trying to nudge your answers in a particular way, and that's okay too. A savvy player will do that, right? They'll try to shape your answers by giving a preamble to their question, right?
I think it's totally fair.
It's totally fair. Yeah, it's totally fine. I mean, usually what I would say is something like, well, that sounds like, who's really in control here, or what is about to happen, or it could even be what here is not what it appears to be. Like, just guide them to one of the questions. Right? That's the important thing.
Right. But if you didn't know that they were looking for traps, like you might not say anything about traps when they asked who's really in control here. You'd just be like, the wizard's really in control here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as long as you're giving them helpful information, as long as you're not cheating them, I think it's, it's okay. I mean, like if they already knew the wizard was in control here, that's not a very fair answer. But no, I'm with you. Like, I think it's okay if the players do the little preamble thing. Great player advice. Like, do a little preamble before you ask your question. It gives your GM. It's actually helpful for the GM, right? Because then the GM gets a better sense of what they're trying to do.
I agree.
All right. Anything else about Discern Realities?
I don't think so.
All right. Let's go to Parley. Okay, Parley. The key to understanding Parley is what counts as leverage. It's right there in the move trigger. When you have leverage on the character, you can manipulate them. According to the move, leverage is something the GM character needs or wants. Some types of leverage are really easy. Like, David, what's some easy, obvious leverage?
Money.
Right.
You could use a coin or several coins to bribe a jailer. A mug of a dwarven stout to loosen the tongue of an old man at the pub. It's got to be dwarven, though. I don't know if it's regular stout.
Everyone knows real ale leverage is dwarven. Yeah.
Right. A rare tome of arcane knowledge to get the local sage to tell you what he knows about the dragon. Those are all good kinds of leverage.
Yeah. And there are also other types of leverage too. Leverage that is maybe a little less obvious. For example, a threat to shank someone with your dagger. That threat is leverage because in that case, what the character wants is for you not to kill them, right? Maybe leverage can be something a little bit more abstract, like your desirability or suitability as a bride for the insipid son of a local lord, right? Importantly, anything you can kind of interpret to be something that the GM character wants or needs, you can use as leverage. It's really quite wide open. That's what I found, at least. Let's talk about the 7 and 9 result. What does it mean to give concrete assurance of your promise? This can come in 2 different ways, right? The concrete assurance, sometimes the GM will provide what this is, in which, like the character that you're parlaying with says, yeah, I'll do that, but first you have to do X or Y or Z, right? That's a common situation. And in that case, advice for GMs, you should be be pretty loose in interpreting what concrete means. Essentially any meaningful gesture beyond the player simply doing the thing they promised to do, or simply saying rather, I promise to do X. Anything beyond just the verbal promise should satisfy as a concrete assurance, right? Just pay attention to what's happening in the fiction. It's not hard. Sometimes the GM doesn't provide this information, right? I've had this happen where the player character has made their promise and the GM character is just kind of standing there looking hesitant or unsure. And it's kind of on the player to say, okay, look, and to show you that I mean it, I'll do this. And in that case, if that's the situation, the player should just be, just go with the most obvious thing, like for David's jailer example, maybe you have to give him the coin right away before they will go do the thing, or you give him half the coin or something like that. Right.
Or if you don't have the coin, you have to give him something else as collateral.
Right. Exactly. You had that example of the sage that you were going to tempt with the rare book, right? Maybe you let them kind of look through the book for a little bit, and then we'll give it to him after he's coughed up the info about the dragon, right? For the person that you are holding at knife point, this is a pretty common situation, actually. You've got the character holding them by knife point. You're threatening to hurt them. And the 7 to 9 happens and you say, look, I'll let you go if you do X. And then you describe your character kind of like easing up a little bit, right? That easing up is a concrete assurance of sort, right? It's like saying, look, I'm backing off a little bit. So those are all sorts of like kind of things you can do to interpret concrete assurance. It's not hard. It probably doesn't necessitate this much discussion about it, right? Like when you're in the fiction and you're kind of just doing whatever makes sense in the fiction, this kind of stuff comes pretty easy. All right, let's go to aid interfere.
Okay, so aid and interfere, 2 moves off of 1 move, really. But as written, it's pretty straightforward. There's a bigger discussion that we've talked about in the past about player versus player conflict in Dungeon World. It's not covered very much in the book, if it's covered at all, but that's what you would kind of use interfere for, but we won't really dive into that too much right now. We'll reference the other episode where we did talk about that a lot. It's a more advanced kind of topic, so we won't cover it here in the basics.
Yeah, we'll have a link in the show notes, but this is something worth looking up for sure. Player versus player conflict is kind of difficult to do in Powered by the Apocalypse games because many Powered by the Apocalypse games don't do a good job of describing how it should work. And Dungeon World is one of those books. Other later Powered by the Apocalypse games did a better job of describing this. And yeah, go look that up. For the purpose of just discussing the basics of aid interfere, not super important. The basics of aid interfere. Let's go to that. Roll plus bond means roll plus the number of bonds you have with that character. Pretty straightforward. Importantly, no matter how many people are aiding or interfering with the principal roll, the bonus that the aided or interfered with character can receive is never more than +1 or -2 respectively. That's really, really important. It's in the rules, but I can't tell you how many tables miss this in their read of the rules, right? I feel like I've seen this so many times where there's a discussion about, wait, how many people can help? How many people can,
Yeah, let's pile on aid.
Let's pile on aid, right? No, you can't. Like I think it's cool for multiple people to be describing how they're helping, but there's never going to be more than a single +1.
Right. So I think the bigger question here is, when do you roll this? Do you roll it before or do you roll it after the principal roll?
Great question. Not clear from the text. Again, a plain reading of the rules, I think, suggests that the person who's doing aid interfere must describe how they're doing so and roll before the principal roller does their roll, but I'm not sure because it's a little unclear from the text.
Yeah, I think you could definitely argue it either way. So we will suggest to you kind of what we do.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that many other Powered by the Apocalypse games actually allow you to roll it after the fact. And I've played those games and it works fine. There's nothing wrong with allowing the roll to take place after the principal roller has done their roll. You and I do something kind of in the middle, or at least I do. I think you do. Something kind of in the middle where someone who is helping describes how they're helping, or hindering, I suppose, if it's interfere. They describe how they're doing it before the roll, but they only do the roll for aid interfere if the bonus granted would make a difference, right? So character A is the principal roller. Character B says, yeah, I'm helping him with that. And then character A rolls and they get an 8 and the +1 wouldn't matter. It would just take them to a 9. And so in that case, I don't have the aider roll the dice. I just they're helping in the fiction, but I don't care about their die roll. That's how I do it. Do you do it that way?
I generally do it that way. There's one circumstance where I won't, because if you let the aid person get away without rolling and it was a 7 to 9, then they might not be subjecting themselves to the same danger.
Right. Yeah.
So if it's a particularly dangerous situation, one where they're already describing themselves aiding, then I might have them roll aid regardless.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the reason why I do it that way is because it's more efficient.
Right. It's an efficiency of your die rolls.
Yeah. It's just to make the combat or whatever it is move a little smoother. Right. And you're right. It is kind of breaking the rules because it allows the aider or the interferer to maybe not be on the hook mechanically for the retribution or cost, right? I will tell you, though, that in play, this makes this has less effect on things than you might imagine. Now, like the situation you've described where like it's a particularly dangerous and reckless thing that the helper is doing. Yeah, I want them to be on the hook for it. But for something a little bit more mundane, it's not as big a deal as you might think. Yeah, it's just the getting the aider or the interferer on the hook for retribution is not a huge deal, because if the principal roller still gets a 7 to 9, you can just wrap up the helper into the complication, right? Like, and you're not really, as long as you're being honest with how it's going in the fiction, you're not really robbing anybody of anything. So anyway, the short end of this, listeners, is the text is super unclear how you're supposed to handle this. And so a lot of groups have just come up with their own ways of interpreting the aid interfere move. I like my way because it's a little more efficient. David is also really on point. This idea of judging the dangerousness of the situation when determining whether the aider has to roll if the bonus wouldn't help the principal roller, right? There's nothing wrong with just making them both roll it. That's totally cool too.
Yeah. Here's one situation that I think is worth pointing out here, since we're talking about aid or interfere. When the principal roll gets a 7 to 9 and the aid or interfere misses, or gets a 6 minus. If it's a defy danger, their action still succeeds. The principal roll still succeeds. Like, you still need to give them that success and not take it away because the person aiding missed. Do you think that's correct?
I do think it's correct. And this really goes down to how inadequate the Dungeon World text is with this move, because the timing of things, the order of things can be so critical or not. I think I've found that like playing aid or interfere by ear works okay, right? Like you can really just kind of play it by ear.
It's the best way to avoid this ambiguous question about what's actually supposed to happen.
Right. Yeah. It's really true. I think the safest thing to do is probably not what we do, which is to always make the aider or the interferer roll, even if their die roll wouldn't help the principal roll. I think that's the safe thing to do. But once you kind of get in the habit of, I guess, like once you get in the habit of running Dungeon World, once you get in the habit of interpreting 7 to 9 results or interpreting missed results and kind of how they impact the overall fiction, the more practice you get, you find that like you can keep it exciting and dangerous without needing the mechanical like enforcement of, oh yeah, that person's definitely on the hook right now because they got a 7 to 9 on their aid roll, right? And I feel like we've gone way beyond the scope of what we're supposed to do here, but listeners, just know that we're probably making this more difficult than it needs to be. I mean, if you just follow the text of the game, you're going to be fine. I mean, honestly, you could even just say, hey, if you're going to aid someone or interfere with them, I suppose that doesn't happen as often, right? If you're going to aid someone, it has to be before the principal roller rolls. That's a perfectly legit way of doing it.
Right. That is the easiest way to handle it, probably. But we have given you more than you asked for.
We've given you way more than you need, right? Yeah. But you're going to find, though, that once you get playing a lot of Dungeon World, you're going to find that like this part of the game is a little unsatisfying, and you're going to wonder why. And the reason why is because I think it's not a very well written move.
Yeah. But that's it for basic moves.
That is it for basic moves. Boy, oh boy. Let's go do some actual play. Hello, listeners. I want to take a second to tell you about the newest issue of Codex Moonlight. It features Pack of Strays, The Moonlit Road, an expansion for the Outcast werewolf game Pack of Strays, which was originally featured in Codex Beasts. Moon Language by Aura Bell, a one-player LARP about communicating with the moon through drawing. Under the Gaze of Ear, a supplement of moonlit mystery for Dungeon World. Apocalypse by Moonlight, a plugin for Powered by the Apocalypse games that help you build emergent mysteries. Our newest Gauntlet Daddy, Muscle Bear. 3 dozen truths revealed by the light of the moon. 9 original illustrations, including a fantastic new cover by Claudia Cangini, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Moonlight, just make a $4 or higher pledge on our Patreon by May 31st. That's patreon.com/gauntlet. Codex back issues are now available on DriveThruRPG. Thanks. Okay, when we last saw Lucero Castafiel, he had just slain a ghoul and discovered that the ghoul bears a tattoo on the back of his neck that indicates that he, maybe in life, was part of the Temple of the Peerless Star. Little unclear. In any case, Lucero has marked it as a point of interest, a thing to be interested in, and continued down the passageway. The passageway is fairly straight, Lucero, in that it kind of just goes in one direction. It does descend. It's going at a gradual descent, so you're definitely going deeper in the ground. You occasionally pass like little closets, here and there on the left and the right. And in some cases, the doors are open or cracked open or busted open or fallen off their hinges from disuse and disrepair. And you can poke your head in there and you don't see anything super interesting. You're looking for your sister. You've got really like simple aims here, right? And she's not in a dusty broom closet. As you're kind of trekking down this corridor, which is, like I said, going gradually deeper, and also the masonry is gradually falling away as well. Like you're starting to get into just like cave passage. I'm curious, what are you thinking? What are you doing?
I've got the torchlight and I'm keeping an eye out for more of these ghouls. I'm very careful whenever I'm checking these closets or whatever that are off of this to make sure that there's not another one in there in the closet. But I got to check because you never know where, if my sister's not alive, there's no telling where her body might have ended up, or when one of these doors will turn out to be another passageway.
Yeah, give me a Discern Realities.
I got an 8.
Nice. Give me one question, and this will apply to just this kind of stretch of corridor journey.
What should I be on the lookout for?
Good question. You will notice footprints disturbing the dust near the threshold of one of the open closet doors. If you kind of poke your head in there, you're going to see a couple more boot prints, smaller boot prints. And it looks like maybe the person dived into this closet to hide or to rest or to catch their breath or something. And then they came out and they continued further down in the direction you're going. So, and because you were able to see the footprints, it means it's happened relatively recently, but relative here in this context means, within the last weeks or months, right?
Okay. Well, at least I got that going for me.
What do you do?
Does it look like they were trying to, like, run? Are they, like, well-spaced out footprints, or are they, like, walking distance footprints?
I'll let you have that one for free. It looks like stumbling footprints. Like they're erratic, irregular.
Okay. That could be a problem, especially if they're smaller, since that could be my sister. She's hurt. So I'm going to pick up the pace.
Yeah. Like I mentioned, it starts to give way to actual rough-hewn cave tunnel. Like at a certain point, they just stopped masoning, right? The subterranean area. And you go through a twisty cave passage, about another 50 or 60 feet. It twists kind of sharply left and right. And then it opens up into a ledge or a bit of like cave shelf that you can stand on that looks out over a much wider, much bigger underground cavern. You see stalagmites, you see stalactites. There is an occasional drip of water coming from somewhere. And it has that smell of damp, almost like mildewy kind of cave smell. What do you do?
I'm going to uncoil my weapon from around me and fix the torch to the end of it and kind of get it swinging a bit so I can see further down and out than this ledge will allow me.
Yeah, give me another Discern Realities.
Okay. Oh, I got a 9. Almost a 10. All right, so...
Too bad you don't have somebody here to help you.
I know. If only I had someone to aid me.
I know. I would then let them roll because their bonus would make a difference.
What here is useful or valuable to me?
You look down into this wider cave space, and it seems you have stumbled onto... I don't know if stumbled onto is the right way of putting it. It doesn't seem like they're making any effort to hide it. But you see what appears to be like another worship space. That you've seen the temple, you've been staying at the temple for a while, and you've seen their sort of like big public temple area where they have the way it works in the main sept of their temple is they raise they pull back the sort of dome roof and the star glows and, revelers and worshipers come and give praise to it or whatever, right? Very theatrical, very fancy. But this looks like another worship area. You see an altar, you see symbols, you see statuary, you see half-burnt candles, prayer mats. I don't know if useful is the right word here. I will give you something useful. Beyond that, you see what appears to be on the altar bloodstains.
How far down? This is down in the chasm.
It is, right, yeah.
How far down?
You can probably, there's like a little path that you can follow if you want to get down there.
Okay.
Kind of goes, like wraps around and goes lower, you know, like off from the little shelf ledge that you're on.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll make my way down there. And as I'm making my way down there, I am looking at all of the implements and things like that to try and figure out if there's something I might know about this that would tip me off that, like, this isn't the same worshippers as the ones up top, or they're worshiping something else.
Yeah, that sounds like Spout lore, actually, because you mentioned what you might know, right? You get a +1 for following up on your previous DR.
Great. That's just the +1 I needed. So I've got a 10 now.
Nice. Something interesting. This is where the real worship of the Peerless Star is taking place. The useful thing to know is that the Temple of the Peerless Star, the true adherents of this faith, are very, very interested in defeating death. They're very, very interested in unlife. And they believe that the star is in fact a portal to the negative plane, the plane of existence that provides the energy needed to power, to reanimate the dead. How do you know all those things?
It's an unrelated bit of information. I didn't know that about the Peerless Star folks until just this moment. But in our family, we've had to deal with a certain amount of undeath in the form of vampires. That's a curse that our family has. So I've had to investigate a variety of different kinds of undeath. And one of those were the text of these necromancers. They were really philosophizing on ways about cheating death or getting around death. And as I get to the bottom, I notice on one of the shelves, right next to the Peerless Star Holy Text, is one of these books by the necromancers.
Nice. I think we'll just end it there. Well, listeners, thanks so much for joining us for Dungeon World Basics Episode 3. If you'd like to get in touch with us, Twitter is a great way of doing that. You can tweet us at @GauntletRPG. This show, of course, being a production of the Gauntlet Network. The Gauntlet is also on G+. Go to the community section of G+, and search for the Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com, and we're on Patreon. We're on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.